ESPN Radio.
Back-to-back games, the Warriors win against the Rockets, against the Spurs. Pretty good.
Bay Area recovering from the loss of the Oakland Raiders. Golden State content to drag them from the depths of despair.
That's got to be the best pair of wins in the NBA this year, I would imagine. I didn't go through every team's schedule and look for the best pair of wins, but I would have to just assume sitting here that at San Antonio and at Houston and at San Antonio on back-to-back nights with wins is the best.
Well, there's a stat for that, Robin. The Warriors are the second team in NBA history to win road games in consecutive days in which both of its opponents had a winning percentage of above .675 or better at least 50 games into a season, the other one being the Spurs back March of 2001.
See, I set you up for that one, right? That was an alley-oop pass.
That was nice. Seamless.
Good dunk, by the way. I mean, you finished it hard.
No doubt. Like a little better than a couple of those JaVale McGee failed flushes last night.
Yeah, I mean, JaVale McGee has made regular appearances on Shaqtin' a Fool. That's where that feud really originated from.
He's an improved He's living his best life right now. I know everyone's making the plea for Shaq to leave him alone, and we finally squashed that beef publicly, but he's been a very meaningful contributor to that team and more than likely will be down the stretch.
The Warriors are really good. I mean, they're on pace to have the fourth best point differential in NBA history, which I guess doesn't sound so impressive because of what they did a year ago. But you're looking at what they're doing now. That was their 9th consecutive win. Of course, they're doing it all without Kevin Durant, whose return is right on the horizon. And if you look at the other teams in the West, I mean, they did it against Houston, last night against the Spurs. Let's start with San Antonio, who's really good. I've said all year, I'm sure you've heard me say it a million times, they don't have the guards. Tony Parker is washed up. Manu Ginobili is washed up. Patty Mills scares me more than both of those guys if I'm an opponent. And when it gets to the playoffs against a team like Golden State, that's where San Antonio just doesn't measure up.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that really is where all of those miles on those old bodies start to add up, because this is what jumped out to me, if you want to talk about stats, is entering Wednesday, the Warriors had lost the 34 of their last 35 regular season games at San Antonio, so specifically at that site, but it's just a place where we've seen them have performances like Manu and company did against Cleveland earlier in the week, where they look great, but once you get to, I mean, rest is always the subject, but when you're talking with those guys that are really up there in age and you get to those playoff games, all of a sudden that does start to compound a little bit, and you're right, that's the trouble area if you're looking for one in the Spurs.
Yeah, and as far as the team in the West that could beat Golden State, here's a team I think could do it. The Rockets' offense with the Jazz's defense.
All right, well, barring some sort of change in league rules, we're going to have a tough time finding our way to that matchup. I'm hopeful. I believe that anything can happen in 2017, but that one might be a stretch.
How about you just give the Rockets Rudy Gobert? I'm comfortable with that. If we can give the Rockets Rudy Gobert, they've got a real shot against Golden State.
That'll be when you know the NBA's gotten to a tough place, when all of this talk about a handful of super teams really dominating, when we adjust the rules so that you can just start sliding bodies around on the rest of the team once you get to playoff time, just to make some sort of competitive balance appear.
We'll make that Straight Talk brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless. Best phones, best networks, half the cost, an amalgamation of other Western Conference playoff teams against Golden State. Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable networks. All right, I don't know if this is considered a hot take or not, but here's going to be my thing today.
Yes.
I believe the reintegration of Kevin Durant.
Oh, don't do it.
Is a bigger threat to the Warriors than any individual team in the Western Conference.
Bam, 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 bam.
And I am not sitting here saying that it's bad that Kevin Durant's coming back. That it's just like I can't.
No, you're saying
in my head.
Just say it. Just say it.
No.
Kevin Durant coming back is a bad thing. Say it. Say it so we can clip it.
It's a nuanced hot take. It's a hot take with a
hot take alert. Hot take alert. Hot take alert.
You're blowing on your plate before you eat it. You know what I mean? It's that kind of hot take.
No. We need the scorcher. We need the one that you can't touch coming out of the microwave because it is I know you don't have a lot of microwave experience, but in my experience, when you leave it in there long, it's scalding hot. You can't touch it. That's how thermonuclear I want this take. Let it flow from you, Robin.
Well, let me set up the context, because Steph Curry has been very, very good as of late, right? In fact, he was asked about the number of assists that he's compiled. I believe it's 3 straight double-digit assist games, and here was his answer.
Just in more better positions with a lot more pick and rolls and just being more aggressive with the mindset of drive and kick. The ball's been moving crazy. Obviously, for me to get assists, guys got to make shots, and we've been doing that. And so it's been a fun way to play. So Coach always talks about promoting ball movement, whether it's through certain sets where I'm setting screens, moving out the ball, or more predictable where you come off a pick and roll, just try to find the open guy. Good things happen.
And that's Steph Curry being the engine of this team, the way he has been in back-to-back MVP years. If you remember at the beginning of the season, he sort of backed off to try and help Durant ease his way in. Now, there's a strong chance Durant comes and they're just the Death Star, and nobody can even come close to touching them. But at the same time, it's almost like doing the beginning of the season over again. They've adjusted. It took them a minute, but they've adjusted to playing without him, and they're starting to look like the Warriors from last year. Now he's got to come back, and it depends on when he comes back. I think I would actually want him back before the playoffs if possible. See, the thing about this take is the first round is basically a warm-up for them, so they can sort of get their training wheels on in that first round before they take them off. But if I'm being honest, and again, I'm not saying they're going to get worse with Durant, that probably, in my mind, is a bigger threat to them because it makes those other teams a bigger threat to them. More than any of these one individual teams, whether it's the Houston Rockets or the Utah Jazz or the San Antonio Spurs, just the possible ramifications of the adjustment.
Gotta say, I'm a bit shocked. I didn't expect to come in here this morning and hear Robin Lundberg say that the Golden State Warriors are going to get worse with Kevin Durant coming back onto the floor. It's really shocking and offensive to my senses. It's going to take a while for us to digest such a smoking hot take.
First and last on ESPN Radio.
Not a big deal when Russell Westbrook gets a triple-double.
No, it's, sun goes up, or moon, was it? Sun goes down, yeah. That's right. Moon goes up.
Well, sun goes up and down, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess it does both at different times. Man, it's early sometimes. I was blown
It's
blown
not
away.
up yet.
I was blown away too. I was getting ready to just shout Mims over the top of that one right there.
Well, the sun doesn't really move.
Well, yeah, if you want to get technical, we're the ones doing the moving. Unless you're a
Well,
flat earther, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Cavs have really struggled since Kyrie Irving said he was a flat earther.
I tell you, there's got to be some sort of correlation between that kind of scientific hubris and the results that have followed for the Cavs.
Yeah, maybe there is. Maybe there's a connection, and nobody's actually gotten to that point yet. But what were you saying? That the sun rises and falls, and the moon, and all that
your
stuff.
usual death taxes, all that stuff.
Yeah,
Russell Westbrook gets a triple-double. It falls right into the same vein. But really, this season it has, and yet on a couple of instances now, he's managed to do something even in that regard that no one else has done.
A special triple-double. What do you call it when he does it? It's like a triple-double. Now, an asterisk in sports implies a negative. So, I mean, because it doesn't necessarily imply a negative in, like, what you're reading. It just means you got to go check this out. But as far as this, it's got to be something different than an asterisk.
Maybe like a plus or like a green mushroom, like a video game green mushroom. Like, this is one up.
I agree. Is that what one up is in every video game? Or is that Mario Brothers?
Yeah, this is Mario Brothers. The green mushroom is the one up mushroom. It gives you an extra life, and so I figure in this one it could be the triple double green mushroom.
What about a star instead of an asterisk?
You could go a star, but I still want to use the Super Mario star, the one that's got eyes.
Russell Westbrook, a triple-double with a green mushroom last night because he scored 57 points against the Magic and added 13 rebounds and 11 assists. The 57 points, the most for a triple-double in NBA history. So, not your run-of-the-mill triple-double, a triple-double the likes of, we always quote these old-time stats with Oscar Robertson or Wilt Chamberlain. None of those guys. Most points ever in a triple-double.
Yeah, and so so far this season, he's had a triple-double, the most points in a triple-double, and not too long ago had the first triple-double where he was perfect from the field and from the free throw line. So accomplishing multiple feats throughout the course of accomplishing a season-long feat we've only seen one other time, he's even found a way to outlast and outdo that. And yet somehow there's still a debate about who the MVP is, which, as you always said, speaks to the strength of this league to an extent.
Yeah, how good the players are. I mean, James Harden's had a marvelous season. Look, you know how I think about LeBron in context of this, but I know he's not going to win it, and it doesn't help his case the way the Cavs have swooned here at the end of the season. So
yeah, worth noting that Oklahoma City did just clinch their playoff spot with that win last night too.
I think I'm ready to say Russell Westbrook's the MVP. You know, as far as who's realistically going to win it, the triple-double stat, there's a part of me that says, well, don't just fall for that because it just has a name. It's an artificial designation. But if you look at the kind of season he's had, some of these gaudy stat lines he's put up, and I get the record aspect of it, but the Thunder at 6 to me, 12 games over 500 is impressive. Like that's not something that should hold them back. They lost Kevin Durant, and they're right there they've basically have the same record as the Los Angeles Clippers. Now the Clippers had a ton of injuries this year, but still they're right in the middle of the Western Conference playoff seedings. Not too far a fall from a year ago, really. Russell Westbrook's averaging a triple-double. He's by far and away, I think maybe, needing to do more than any other player with a nod to Harden. I think Westbrook's the MVP.
I said it yesterday, so I'm glad you've come around to my way of seeing the world, Robin. But I think you're right, and I think normally when we look at a gaudy stat line, you're right. Just because it has a name doesn't make it better than everything else. But when you look at gaudy stat lines, like we just saw that with Devin Booker where he scored 70 points, but everyone said it came in a loss and the team was trying to facilitate that kind of point output for him once they started going that way. So did it feel all the way genuine? Did it feel all the way earned? With Russell Westbrook, as you mentioned, it's been necessary. I forget what it is offhand, but we talked multiple times about how disproportionately favorable their record is when he has a triple-double because it's been necessary for that team's success. It's been what's buoyed them at other times because he's the only show in town, but he's found a way to translate that kind of output directly into wins for the most part, which is something that people value, I think, when it comes to this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, they won, 55 games a year ago? And where are they at? 43, I think, right now. So it's not that precipitous a fall off, and it's not just Kevin Durant, Serge Ibaka, not a member of that team either. So I don't think they fell off in a way that's crazy. I mean, they're representative considering where they were a year ago. If they win a couple more games this year, they could wind up being 6 games worse than they were last year, having lost 2 of their best players.
Yeah, which I think is exemplary. I mean, you went from a team that we watched up 3-1 on the Warriors in the Western Conference Finals and talked about what a great young core they've got between them and between Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, and Steven Adams at that point going forward, to stripping away a lot of the other pieces that have made that great along the way, and him still managing to get them to this point. All the reasons I'm more than comfortable with commemorating the individual effort that I think we all thought we were going to get when Kevin Durant departed, and we said, okay, it's Russell Westbrook, the one-man show on Broadway, and it's delivered in almost every way possible.
First and last, presented by Progressive Insurance. We'll compare rates for you so you get the best deal, even if it's not with us, saving you time and money. Now that's Progressive. Call or click today. I think it's been better than we could have thought, too. You switch sides on me. Now you're about to meet Westbrook. You get immortalized in the Kendrick Lamar song. As good as you thought he would be, and as much as we knew he would need to be this tour de force, I think he's been better.
He has been, and to give a number again to what I said before, talking about them winning when Russell Westbrook has a triple-double, an 81.5% winning percentage when he has a triple-double in a game. So it's translated directly, and without a triple-double, a 33% win percentage in those games. So it's been the only thing that's allowed Oklahoma City to have the kind of success that they've enjoyed this year.
He's beasted in close games too, where they've really needed him. I mean, he's never been a good shooter down the stretch of games. He's not a good shooter in general, but they've won a lot of close games, and they've played a lot of close games considering they're not a great team. 37-23 in games within 5 points in the final 5 minutes. So getting a lot done with a plus 24.7 net rating in those games.
And doing it all, I mean, rest is something that comes up, but especially now, you have to imagine it's going to weigh on the mind of people that him and James Harden are the only ones in this MVP race we're talking about that have played all the games right now. And I don't say that to diminish the other guys, but to highlight the fact that he's been operating at this clip, doing all of these things for his team every single night throughout the course of a season, and he never seems to let up. Fatigue never seems to set in for this guy. So the level of physical conditioning that Russell Westbrook has demonstrated throughout the course of this season has been exemplary.
All right, I'm ready to return to my little hot take. ESPN Radio tweeted out a quote from me. Reintegrating Durant into the lineup is a bigger threat to Golden State Warriors than any team in the West. Scotty Oates tweets in the long run, Durant won't make them worse, but trying to get him back in the flow when it's all or nothing in the playoffs will likely be difficult, while Cavs Dub City tweets in, will Durant's return make them worse? Of course not. Are you high? Well, again, that's not exactly what I said, but here's a stat for you. Ethan Strauss, who covers the Warriors. The Warriors' defensive rating before the Durant injury, 101.3, very good. But their defensive rating after the Durant injury, 99.9. Shocking, actually, that they've gotten better defensively considering how well Durant played defensively this year. But that's statistical proof that this is not a mirage. They are playing darn good basketball.
Yeah, and you know what? I won't co-sign your scorching hot take because I think on his best day when Kevin Durant comes back, the reason this team looked different is because when he's on the floor fully capable, he's the best player on their team. And so I think that's what happens. But what you got to.
Well, I was going to say you're not co-signing my scorching hot take. I want you to take the other position though. Then which individual team in the West is a bigger threat to the Warriors than because I'm not saying Durant makes them worse. I'm saying reintegrating him after they learn to play again the way they did play with Steph Curry dominating the ball and all that stuff.
The Utah Jazz, that'll be my team, but that's purely arbitrary. But my point was, I'm not worried about him reintegrating. If you were getting midseason form Kevin Durant and reintegrating him, that's cool. The problem is you're getting Kevin Durant that spent the last however many weeks rehabbing coming off of this injury. And being a taller, longer guy, that's going to play a lot more of a factor in. We've seen these kind of injuries affect big men more, and Kevin Durant qualifies size-wise nearly as a big man. That's what I worry about. Is he going to get back to that form in time to help them?
First and last on ESPN Radio.
I'm sorry, I can't act like I'm okay right now. I have to bring people into our world just for a second before we get into this.
The floor is yours.
We were sitting here during the break talking, and we found out. So we've got new producer guy Dan on the show, and come to find out in some brand, he was discussing how much he would like to dress like I do in the morning, which isn't well. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. We're in a dimly lit studio. I wear hoodies and jeans every day. But then we somehow got on the subject of jeans. We find out Dan is actually not just opposed to, he's afraid of jeans to the point where he's had panic attacks wearing denim on his lower half.
Minor denim phobia, please.
That's not how you sold it to me. Don't play this up for air. You are terrified of jeans. You are like dark hallway in a horror movie, jeans on the other side, fear-induced sweating and crying, afraid of jeans.
Yeah, the story I told you was I was on my way to a party with an ex-girlfriend a few years ago, and I jeans is what people wear in public, generally speaking, to bars, restaurants, whatever. So I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to suck it up. I put on some high socks and some long compression short types. So there was very little skin exposed to the jeans. We get halfway to the party and I just start sweating profusely. And I'm just like, we got to go home. I can't do it. I cannot do this. I turned the car around. I drove home. I threw on some comfy sweatpants and we went to the party.
So what you're saying is I don't have to worry about you showing up to work in a Canadian tuxedo anytime soon.
I don't know what that is.
It's where you've got jeans and the denim jacket. So would denim up top bother you as much? Is it purely the material? What is this?
That sounds like a legitimate nightmare.
Okay, so we know if we ever have any sort of wager on the show that involves
Dan, I won't do it.
The payoff is going to be him wearing a Canadian tuxedo.
No, it will not. I will never agree to those terms.
I ate a bag of marshmallows. He also has 3 cats. I like cats, but when you put it together with the jeans thing,
There are days now between the two of you, I really wonder who I'm doing the show with. Like, what group of monsters we've assembled here at the Worldwide Leader that I'm forced to come in close contact with every day.
I don't have a natural segue between that and the next topic, so we're just going to go and discuss it. Jeurys Familia, Mets closer, hit with a 15-game suspension by Major League Baseball in a domestic violence-related charge. The charge was dismissed as far as law goes, but Rob Manfred felt that his conduct on the night that the alleged incident occurred violated their policy and warranted the discipline, even if the evidence reviewed by his office, and this is a quote, does not support a determination that Mr. Familia physically assaulted his wife or threatened her or others with physical force or harm. And this entire subject, of course, is discussed a little bit more in New York than it might be in other places, including on the Michael Kay Show, which you can hear on 98.7 ESPN in New York. And Michael Kay strongly disagreed with the suspension.
If he didn't physically harm her, didn't threaten her, what did he do? I need to know, what did he do? He's insisting, and this is in the release by Major League Baseball, I just want to be known, I did not physically harm her, threaten her, anything. So what did he do? Because if all of that is true, didn't harm her, didn't threaten her, didn't touch her, why is he being suspended? Does that make sense to you? You think I'm being heavy-handed? You think I'm being flip on this? I don't know. Again, I'm not going to comment on the amount of time, except to say, why is he getting any time if he didn't do any of that?
Well, my counter to that would be, all right, if he didn't do anything, well, clearly he did enough to where the cops got called. Clearly he did enough to where he was arrested at some point. It was a misdemeanor simple assault charge that ended up getting dropped. But enough happened in that moment to where action was taken. And now we know legally the burden of proof, all these different things that you need. And now it also gets complicated because this is his wife who didn't want to press charges going forward. But enough happened to the point where a league, a sports league, and I said this when we talked about it with the NFL, and Major League Baseball has really set the standard for this, which is if it's domestic violence adjacent, if it's even close, you go out and you suspend them. Because you as a league have to protect your image as a league and say that this is something that we're not going to tolerate. Even if at points like this, even if something really hadn't happened, even if that was the case, even if at some point it infringes upon someone who really truly is innocent, you have to do that because of the understanding that your job as a league is to protect your image, and that's exactly what Rob Manfred and Major League Baseball are doing.
Rob Manfred seems like a reasonable guy. So I would first make that the initial point. Then when someone says they weren't physically violent, doesn't mean that they weren't. But even if, let's just say he wasn't, there's also things like verbal abuse, physical intimidation, a number of things that can come into play. And as you were mentioning, the burden of proof is much different. I was a juror on a murder trial. I took that very seriously, and the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt and all that stuff. But that's not the standard at all here. We're not talking about him losing his employment. We're not talking about him going to jail. We're talking about a 15-game suspension, which is not really that much, especially he's not an everyday player. He's a closer, which more than a starting pitcher, a 15-game suspension. But what he might appear in a third of those games, somewhere between a third and two-thirds of those games if it's really close. And as far as hurting the team, a lot of people can close most games. You know how I feel about closers and just that role in general. So this is not some sort of devastating blow to the Mets season or devastating blow to his career. And as a reasonable person, I'm assuming, who doesn't have to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, I just don't see the controversy around this too much.
No, you mentioned the amount of game suspension is up there. Like, you understand, for any guy, you're missing time, you're missing paychecks, all those things. So it's the only way they've got to affect you at that level outside of fines. But again, I'll keep going. And I said this about the NFL, about the reasons they've run into issues with their domestic violence policy is because what you told people it was versus what it ended up being different. And a lot of that wanted to be out of fairness to the different situations and understanding that not every instance of this is exactly the same. But I said that can't matter, especially now when the minute you under-deliver on something like this, you risk provoking the hordes. And, I mean, for all the other reasons, we know domestic violence is a super complicated issue. There's, the talk of do zero tolerance policies and these kind of punishments even benefit people involved in the situation. But as a league, again, that's unfortunately a secondary concern to the PR that you've got to control and the image that you've got to protect. And so I completely understand Rob Manfred stepping in and saying, all right, we, by the court of law, can't say that something happened here physically, that the charge that was originally levied there holds up, but enough happened for this to have popped up on our radar at all. You've brought this attention to our league, and you're going to be punished accordingly.
Yeah, and I hate comparing domestic violence to other domestic violence and all that stuff. It's slippery slope, like power ranking domestic violences and all that. But if you look at the 4 suspensions that have happened under Major League Baseball's domestic violence policy, which was enacted in August 2015, you had Hector Olivera, 82 games, Jose Reyes, 51 games, Aroldis Chapman, 30 games, and Jeurys Familia, 15 games. So his suspension is 50% of the previous low of a suspension under the domestic violence policy. So it is being treated less severely than the other ones have been.
It is, which is sort of the range that the NFL got in trouble for using at different times, the range that they opened up to 6 games with room for less or room for more, that showed some of the 2-game suspensions that we got, and conversely the 10-game number that we've seen on the top end. And so that playing out in a different way in Major League Baseball. And another big part of it is Familia's not going to fight this. He's not going to try to appeal this, which also tends to come up a lot in the Major League Baseball when you talk about labor piece, and why they've enjoyed so much of that is because they don't allow these ongoing public battles of appeals and the players versus the league, where all of a sudden the PA is forced to come out and fight with you, fight for you because you are the player and they do represent you, in a case that's not going to appeal very much at all to the public that's forced to witness it.
First and last on ESPN Radio.
The Knicks are out of the playoffs for the 4th straight year, and they're not good. But the thing about the Knicks, longer than that, that's like a little payoff joke to a tease, right? The Warriors clinched the playoffs. It feels like around Christmas time. It feels like the Knicks season was over around the same time. The ramifications with the Knicks are what's going to happen with Phil Jackson and what's going to happen with Carmelo Anthony. Well, last night, Carmelo Anthony spoke, I think, probably in the plainest terms about his future, or perhaps lack thereof. And this is after a waxing by the Miami Heat. And shout out to the Heat. Speaking of shout.
Yeah.
What a season. 37-38. Just a game under 500 with that roster, having lost, all the big 3 are gone now. Incredible job. And in fact, Mike D'Antoni might be the favorite for Coach of the Year. I'm not so sure Eric Spoelstra doesn't deserve it.
Oh, and what a, I guess, career arc for him, a guy that during the Big 3 era was basically just there, in most people's eyes, not to screw it up, to be a puppet for Pat Riley. And in that time, certainly grew as a coach during that experience, there's no doubt, and has put it on display with this team. I mean, it's gone from Wade County to Wait County there for Dion Waiters and that company there. And even now, I know Dion Waiters has been injured for a little bit here, but Eric Spoelstra continues to put that team in a position to succeed. It's been really impressive.
But when you're Carmelo Anthony and the Knicks, whether or not the Heat have exceeded expectations, when you get blown out by a team starting Rodney Magruder and Luke Babbitt, it can hit you particularly hard. And Carmelo, he spoke after the game about, one, his current role with the New York Knicks.
At this point, I think my role is to, be there for those guys, the younger guys throughout this time, and help them along the way, not just, in the games, but in practice and, in other ways, just to be there for them. I don't think me going out there trying to score 30 and 40 and, every night and playing that way is going to, help them out at this point. I think for them it's just more about, getting that experience. I said that before, getting that experience and letting them, go out there and play through that right now.
And 2 spoke about his future.
I think it's, I see the writing on the wall. I see what it is. I see what they're trying to do. And it's just me accepting that, so that I think that's what, puts me at peace, just knowing and understanding how things work. I'm at peace with that.
It's impressive that this is what's finally broken Melo, because so much of the season we've lauded him for his strength and leadership in certain ways, that amidst all of the turmoil that we've seen from the Knicks, forgetting just the on-court product that, as he said, throughout this whole season, we've had one stretch of playing good basketball early in the season and things shifted after that. But the off-court soap opera that has been the New York Knicks, the traveling circus there with Phil Jackson and the triangle and all of the swirling, talk through the media using mouthpieces and Twitter, Melo's been the one guy through all that who has stood up and had to answer things and has done so really admirably and very well in a lot of senses. And to just see now him finally, and maybe it is an end of the season type thing where you've been worn down by the grind of the season and all of these things finally coming to a head, but it's almost sad to see for a guy that has talked about loving New York so much and being a Knick meaning something to Carmelo Anthony, and that always not playing out in the best way for the team, but still to have that sentiment there and to now see a guy who through all of this has finally resigned himself to the fate that he, I guess, believes is coming now is kind of a bummer to see.
Well, it sounds in those comments that basically we can sit here and go, oh, Carmelo Anthony's getting traded this summer.
And he's finally okay. He's okay enough with that and really beaten down enough by the situation to cede that control, because so much of this we said was the staring contest between him and Phil of understanding where they both were contractually and which one could outlast the other. And I always gave that nod to Melo. I said I wouldn't give Phil Jackson that satisfaction. It sounds like the whole circumstances coming together on this one have been enough for Melo to even say, okay, I'm better off elsewhere. It's better off for everyone if I go, and that's a testament to just how bad things have gotten there.
Yeah, because in case you're unaware, Carmelo Anthony has a no-trade clause, so he has to give permission for a trade to happen. It's something he's been unwilling to waive. It still doesn't change the fact that he can sort of handpicked his list of suitors and destinations, and it does hurt the Knicks as far as what they get in return. And their leverage, is about as low as it's ever going to be in a trade for Carmelo Anthony. But you're also at the point of no return. Carmelo sounds like a broken man there. The Knicks are a broken franchise. Something's going to give this summer.
It is, and listen, you've still got a number of other things to deal with if you're the New York Knicks. The part that's interesting for me is where does he end up? Where does a player with Carmelo's skill set at his age right now, knowing all of the things you're going to have to take on, where is the best fit? Where does he deem the best fit? And who is the most open to that? Because so much of it was around the trade deadline this year in the NBA that has all of these implications on the rest of your season. If you're a contender, where he would want to go, it could affect the course of your season in a way. All of a sudden in the offseason, you've got time to plan. You can make moves around this that help put you in a better position with him on your team. So we get to open up that whole can of worms again once this really takes off.
The problem is there aren't that many teams where it makes a ton of sense. You say the Clippers, right? A team like the Clippers. Well, that doesn't solve their main issue, which is the lack of wing players and versatile defenders. So you go up and down and you say, which team does it make the most sense on? Well, look, the Cavs, they already have Kevin Love. It's essentially the same deal. I could make a case for a couple of the small market teams. I could make a case for Utah. I could make a case for Oklahoma City, sliding into the power forward spot, playing along with Russell Westbrook. The question is, Carmelo seems like a big city dude.
Yeah, that's always going to be part of it, because he's made that very known that a lot of this was he liked living in New York, that he was happy there, he enjoyed that lifestyle, and is he willing to take a back seat to that? You mentioned up-and-comers. Is Los Angeles a place that could potentially... The Lakers, could that be appealing to Carmelo?
Only in the sense of he'd be wearing a Lakers uniform and being in Los Angeles. Not in no way in a basketball sense. The Lakers are far, far away. They're 21-53. They are just awful.
And you mentioned the Cavaliers in the first breath of that statement. We know him and LeBron playing together is something that both of those sides have indicated is appealing to them. And I understand the Kevin Love aspect, but if this finally is the year that the Cavs have an exit before the NBA Finals, is it something they mull over a little more seriously and saying, all right, this version of the roster, maybe we've reached the peak. Maybe we've tapped out what we can accomplish with this group, and adding that different injection of life into there might be a little more of an appealing option.
I actually think Boston and Washington make more sense. Those two teams, if you're looking at the Eastern Conference landing spots.
Well, Boston, we've always talked about them potentially being that one veteran piece away, and now they've sped up the timeline for them this season. We talked about the moves they didn't make around the deadline, and they still sit there now at first place in the Eastern Conference, so it's hard to say that was the wrong move. But we've always talked about how much that young group could benefit from a veteran presence of someone, and Carmelo Anthony seems like he could be that someone. You're right.
And if you're one of these teams, I guess the argument for pouncing would be Carmelo's probably at the stage in his career where he's going to be the most willing to compromise on his role, his fit, and where he's going to be. And also you're going to have to give up the least amount that you would have to give up. In the past, this is the kind of player who, I mean, just think about what he was traded for initially when the Knicks made the trade to bring him in from Denver. That's no longer the case. You might be able to get him for pennies on the dollar, and that makes it a little bit more enticing.
First and last on ESPN Radio.
We were talking about a trade possibly happening with Carmelo Anthony before the break, and I referenced an NFL player of similar star caliber possibly being traded. And what's interesting about this is that when you're talking about players and being identified with a team, it's usually the quarterback, right? You have to be really good or really well known for a non-quarterback to be associated with one team.
Yeah, but that being said, that one team, especially over the course of this era in the NFL, you could definitely argue for a couple of guys has been the Seattle Seahawks.
And Richard Sherman, aside from maybe Russell Wilson and Marshawn Lynch, has been the most identified person on that Seattle Seahawks team, and there's a possibility of him being traded. At least that was broached by Michael Smith and Jamel Hill on SportsCenter last night.
Based off Carroll's comments, kind of sounds like he wouldn't mind seeing Sherman leave to some degree. He called what Sherman went through last year self-inflicted, referring to a couple sideline blowups he had during the season.
I didn't take it that way.
Really?
I took it as...
Is it kind of telling, though, that they were listening to trade offers, or was that just business as usual?
Look, nobody other than Russell Wilson should be untouchable. I mean, that's how the Seahawks became the Seahawks. And look, I think it's a message to Sherman to say nobody's untouchable. Everybody can be moved for the right price. But more than that, I got him saying, you know what, you're into a lot of things. You're a spokesperson for the league. You're doing a lot off the field. And you blew up a couple of times. Just get back to being one of the premier corners. That's what I took it as.
The fact he said
I want to move him.
He played with edge all season. He was talking
never
about
reset.
He never reset. It was interesting. I think, though, that in terms of
now, Pete Carroll, he had a lot of other things to say.
Yeah.
Now, that's, of course, on the reports that they are fielding offers for Richard Sherman. I think Jamel had a point there, Mike, because it did seem like there was a little bit of an under-the-surface beef between Pete Carroll and Richard Sherman. Richard Sherman's the kind of personality where it's great for a while and then maybe he wears on you over the long haul because he says some extremely enlightening things and then he could say some extremely infuriating things. But the idea that he was like openly questioning and screaming about the play calling or throwing on fourth down and stuff like that on the sideline has to get under the skin of Pete Carroll.
Exactly, and that's the type of distraction's been the word of the word of the month in the NFL, talking about a different player, one that Richard Sherman actually had comments about. But when it comes to that stuff is distracting to a sense to a team, and it does hit that fever pitch to where you have to decide value versus that, and it gets interesting with Richard Sherman and really any guy in that Seattle secondary. The Legion of Boom became that phenomenon when we saw them drum the Denver Broncos in that Super Bowl. I think that's really the height of the stardom for that secondary. You talk about becoming household names. We've also seen how volatile it is when you remove one of those pieces. When Cam Chancellor had the holdout situation, that defense struggled to the point where he said, I had to come back because I want to be out there for my brothers. I want to be out there for my team. Earl Thomas went down with injury last year, and it was a decidedly different defense as a whole. And so we don't know what that would look like with Richard Sherman out, gone from that equation. But it seems like anytime you've removed one of those guys, it's changed that way for the worse. So it's one thing to field offers. It's another to make that decision and say, all right, we have to make sure that we've got that heir apparent, someone we think can fill that void, waiting in the wings.
But in the NFL especially, there's that point where Richard Sherman, I don't think any of us are going to say is over the hill and done, but he may have peaked and is on the way down, and therefore the value to the Seahawks they may no longer feel is quite in line with everything else that they might deem a distraction that comes along with him. So they could be assessing it and saying, all right, we no longer feel like this guy is a game-changing, worthy of the moniker Legion of Boom, so now's the time to start at least testing the market.
It also lets you know how much of an issue this must have been for Pete Carroll to address it and for this to come up at all, because this is the coach of the team that we always talk about from the outside looking in and said, this is a coach who allows players to speak his mind, who in a league where we so often talk about people trying to stifle personalities, he allows them to flourish. He sees that as the strength of his team, a team that had Marshawn Lynch on it that was a big personality, albeit a quiet one for us in the media and in the public at certain times, and has allowed Richard Sherman to be outspoken on a number of these issues and promoted that as a strength of his team. For him to now come out and say, you know what, maybe we've hit the point where this isn't so great, lets you know, all right, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah, and Pete Carroll addressing it, period. It's like earlier in the show we played a clip of Jason Garrett talking about Tony Romo's durability. That's one of those sort of siren comments. He didn't say anything, necessarily offensive or demonstrative, but even that mention, without just brushing it off or saying, guys, it's overblown, he opened the door toward it. He cracked the door toward it. And the same thing goes on here, because these sort of things, typically you just totally ignore them, say they're not true at all. You don't give them any, to harken back to the bumpin' music, credence. And he did. I mean, by Pete Carroll even mentioning Richard Sherman and saying things like, here's a quote, "You're either competing or you're not, and so we've always had to be open for everything, every suggestion that comes along. There have been some teams that have called, and so we've talked about it, but he's extremely important to our football team." That's a message to Richard Sherman. That's not only an admission that the possibility exists they could trade him, but I think it's also, hey, you want to stay here, you want to be a part of this, let's figure this all out.
Which is a weird check yourself moment in Seattle, and we talked about this on the show note last night leading up to it, but producer guy Dan mentioned that he likes seeing this mentality. It's what we see from the Patriots all the time, that no one is above being dealt, that they're going to make always the right football move for them based on when your value to them is at the point where they can get the best return off of it. But that's also with a group in the Patriots that we give the benefit of the doubt to every move they make. They dealt Jamie Collins, they dealt Chandler Jones. We looked at that and said, okay, net good. You must have something figured out. The Seahawks are probably another team that have that level of clout. But in general, if you're a fan, is this something you look at and root for? Say, yeah, we want our team to have this mentality. We trust our organization enough to deal a guy who's a superstar in this league, who's one of our star players, and say we trust you enough to make this move, because I don't think there's a lot of teams that have that clout with their fan bases, that have that clout in general, to where they can afford to make that move and see it not somehow be a referendum on the future of their job.
It'll probably be the Patriots that trade for him, and then we get the whole Richard Sherman, going into the Patriots' way. Look at that. They can do whatever they please. They are the almighty Patriots.
Exactly. Coming off the reports that the Patriots say now that they don't have plans to move Malcolm Butler, who they've had a tenuous offseason with, all of a sudden, wouldn't that be the Patriot way to make that move in an offseason where they've made more moves and more moves that have rattled the NFL than we're traditionally accustomed to? Would be the perfect icing on the cake, especially with a team that they've got a little bit of history with.
First and last on ESPN Radio.